So I wanted to set the table a bit. You and I exchanged a few emails back and forth, but after we spoke, I felt like it would have been great if we had 2 hours to talk about all the things you write about and think about. And there was
Yes.
this one, not one, but like a collection of big ideas that we absolutely did not talk about when we spoke last. And then I thought, well, he's appearing on all these other podcasts I listen to. Surely someone is going to ask him about this. And I think um, maybe Amy at Cook Political Report asked you in like the last 3 minutes of your conversation.
Yeah,
And I was like, that is not enough time. This is too big of an idea for a 3 minute rundown.
yeah,
And then I got mad and said, well, I want to ask him about this because it
sure.
is the idea that is most missing in certainly in polling, but perhaps because it's missing in polling, it is missing in the way we talk about the electorate and how we talk about the country. And that is, you wrote a series of posts that sort of built up to the kind of red nation, blue nation idea, walking through these more meaningful divides than mere demographics and things like educational attainment, which has really become, particularly in the Trump era, this shorthand for like what polling gets wrong and what the real difference between blue states and red states are and all of that. And
Right.
this explanation is far, far, far more compelling and frankly historical than I think the way that we kind of try to talk about these differences through very simplistic, overly simplistic, not really very useful crosstabs on basic demographics. And so maybe the place to begin here is for me to not talk and let you kind of sort of lay out the structure of the divides and how they intersect with each other and really create two separate, not separate, but two different versions of America that people are in fact currently living in, um, and how that affects electoral politics. And
Sure.
and I'll ask questions as we go. It's a
Sure.
big brief, but you
So
know what you're talking about.
yeah, so I think, one of the things, and I think in your last podcast, you said this well about forecasting, that if you have an equation and plug numbers in, you're going to get an answer. And that doesn't mean the answer means anything, but it means that you inevitably have a number. And numbers have a greater sort of credibility, unfortunately, than arguments or words right now. Right? Can't argue with a number, right?
Right.
And so the numbers in crosstabs can either be thought of as the inevitable aggregation of things that may or may not be significantly alike, but you're still just adding up numbers and we'll get a number, right? And it flattens the American experience because you've chosen what you're going to count, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where like this all goes off the rails, because if you don't have any criteria ahead of time for what constitutes a reasonable categorization of people, then you end up, without even realizing it, that you're a victim of a conceptual conceit that's kind of hidden, that says that being, say, non-college is what's important. And therefore, when you report non-college numbers, no one says, well, should we be looking at non-college numbers, right? It's kind
Mm-hmm.
of like reinforced by data collection, right? Now, the the sort of starting at the polling end of this,
Mm-hmm.
the the limitation that is unavoidable in polling is that it has no window into history,
Mm-hmm.
into what brings people to the day that they are answering the survey,
Right.
right? And so to sort of work off of the non-college bit for a minute, and then I'll go to the two nations to try to sort of show why, hopefully, oh my God, we shouldn't be thinking about it this way, right? So probably if I say, like white non-college, everybody listening to this is going to think of a burly guy in a Wisconsin diner. And because as humans, when we hear cues like that, it immediately maps to an avatar and like erases the diversity within the category, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we don't realize that for all those sort of manufacturing white non-collar guys, there are more non-college healthcare workers in the country,
Right.
right? There are more people serving you at fast food restaurants or delivering you groceries, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you have that avatar in your mind, you are on your way to completely not understanding American politics, right? Because you think that Democrats need to appeal to the burly guy to win non-college voters, right?
Right.
Now, the other part of it is that the two sections of America that have existed since our founding, they were sort of the, the founding idea, are really important. And one last point about the polling part is that when you do a national poll, and we do so many, media does so many national polls because they're cheap,
Mm-hmm.
right? And quick, and you get a lot of clicks,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, but and then everybody sort of says, well, this is why Democrats are this way, or this is why Republicans are that way, off of that, and all of that, as if America was a uh, natural demographic constituent assembly,
Right.
right? Where the way laws get made is like do you have the votes of non-college voters? Do you have the votes of black voters, et cetera, right?
Well, it
And
does a couple of things, right? Like
yeah,
it does that. It also assumes that there is, especially in polling, it assumes there is an issue set that correlates to that
right,
demographic marker. It
right,
assumes, and you pointed this out, that like, is educational attainment an identity? Like, is that the
right,
organizing principle around which I understand myself, that I went to
right,
college or I didn't go to college? And maybe for some people that's true, but for a whole lot of people, I imagine they don't spend a lot of time thinking about the thing they didn't do. And
right,
so so there's
right.
one part about it. The other thing that's interesting about that particular one, and this was in your the limits of education
Yeah,
essentialism piece, was like you took other factors that had much stronger correlations to
right,
party preference. And it seems like we have settled on this one because it's like a relatively polite question, whereas like the racial resentment question is not that polite.
right,
And and we ask it all the time. We don't ask the racial resentment question all the time in our national polling. So we've got that. We've got urbanicity. Like we always ask those two kind of demographic questions. And I was finding myself thinking like, why wouldn't we use other factors? Is it because like it starts to tilt into like, uh-oh, we're starting to look partisan because we're asking those questions about something like racial resentment, or trying to do cross hatching tabs? I would call them just segments, beyond, these nice little tidy columns where you can compare the urbanicity, but you can't compare black and white urbanicity. There's a little bit of comparing college and non-college for white and non-white, but it also seemed like non-college is really just measuring white people. Like that when we're talking about non-college voters, we're imagining that white burly guy in a Wisconsin
yeah,
diner. We're not picturing, um, you know, we're not picturing an African American person. We're
right.
not
And
picturing a
we're
Latin
not only
American
that,
person.
we're not picturing the likely
We're picturing
woman
good.
who's pouring his coffee. And we're not picturing the Gen Z folks in the booth by the window, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even in that diner, we're not seeing the full.
Yes. Nearly
Um,
2/3 of which are not going to college.
right.
Yeah.
So, oh no, of that group, none of them go to college, right?
No.
The
Most of them are
but
still in high school, I guess, right? So,
yeah, but um, the reason I think that I mean, I think there are different reasons why we don't do it that way for different things. I think the in the piece that I wrote that you mentioned, the racial resentment would be a difficult one to do because there isn't as much agreement about like how you would bin someone in that, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reason I used that was to show how much more power you get out of looking for what people like actual markers of what people disagree about
Mm.
than their the sort of choice demographic characteristic, right? And I think like both cause and effect of looking at these anodyne categories is that we don't have to talk about the values and issues that divide us on their own terms,
Mm.
but have developed this, I think, to previous generations, what would look really bizarre, where like no one anymore really debates whether this or that policy would be good for America. They debate whether it would help or hurt Democrats winning. And
Right.
so everybody in the conversation actually doesn't have to expose their own positions, but can advocate for their positions by claiming that some demographic group cares so much about it that Democrats can't win without doing what secretly the person saying it wants them to do,
Right.
right?
Right.
And it's really hurt the discourse, right? Because we're not,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think even 10, 15 years ago, like during the debate on the ACA, right, we were talking about what's the best way to provide people with health care. Now we talk about what's the best message about healthcare to help Democrats win, right? But no one's talking about how to improve American healthcare, right?
Right.
It's kind of like just kind of gotten stolen from us. Um, but to sort of get to the sectional point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was saying it's like we're not a constituent assembly, and if you're a candidate, you don't get bonus points for votes from non-college voters, and you don't like get demerits for white college voters, right? I mean, they all count the
Right.
same, right? And it's not a national vote. It
Until
is.
JD Vance gets his new policy where parents get extra
Well,
voting
that's
power.
true.
Yeah.
That's true. Like that. That's to be like that. Hopefully, we can forestall
Mm.
the. But the other thing is that America is one of the most federalist countries in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there is no election in America that elects people nationally. Zero, right? Everybody who serves in our government is elected from a place, right?
Right.
Sovereignty in America are the 50 states, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just what it is, right? But we don't analyze politics that way.
Right.
Now, if in my like really rapid history, right, that at the founding, you had a section of the country that was committed to slavery. You had another section of the country that was not, and that like, was more interested in a country that looked like the Declaration of Independence's values, and that was more sort of connected to education and commerce and what was called then free labor. And it's best to think of the original Constitution as a mutual defense treaty among those 13 colonies. That the threats of, it's hard to imagine, is the most powerful nuclear power in the world, that at the time it was a really fragile project with continuing attacks from the French, from the Spanish, from the English, and of course the wars with Native Americans, right? And so the Constitution was a compromise that would make sure that in terms of defending the 13 colonies, they'd all be on the same, all be together, right?
Right.
And to do that, the Constitution had to allow sort of the economic model of the South
Mm-hmm.
remain undisturbed. And that economic model has always been and continues to be really based on low wage work and on extraction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the economic model outside that region, more or less, has been about industry and about international commerce and more,
Right.
now within knowledge economy, tech, communications, all of sort of those kinds of things, right? And a
Yeah.
comparably higher wage economy and comparably one with more unions,
Mm-hmm.
which is really important too. And and obviously that is the tension that keeps dividing America, right? That's why the South seceded. That's why the KKK terrorism overcame Reconstruction. For a brief period in the 20th century, mostly exogenous forces started to narrow those differences.
Mm-hmm.
And after the end of the Cold War, but especially after Obama's election, that sectionalism came roaring back ferociously to the levels it was before the New Deal.
Yeah.
And
You have some
so,
great visualizations of the way the polarization kind of ebbs and flows, and that there's this like roughly Great Depression to 2000 period where there's a lot less of this highly polarized
right,
presidential preference where the parties sort of approach each other. I won't say that they get into agreement per se, but they approach each other. There is more of this rapprochement that was not there before and has not been there since, and
right,
that divide continues to widen. It's a very interesting thing, coming out of advertising as I do. There is another kind of cultural anomaly that happens right in that period, and that's the rise of broadcast mass media, where everyone's listening to the same radio and watching the same television for about 50 years. And then by, after 2000, that's over also. So in addition to, and I think the other thing that's interesting about that, just to talk about the exogenous events thing,
yeah,
there was a sense, even at the very beginning of the pandemic, I think that, and with the invasion of Ukraine and those sorts of things, that those exogenous forces would have that same coalescing effect, that would have that like, oh, we're all in it together effect on American politics. And that, of course, is not what happened. And I think there is something different about the polarization we see now, but it's a really interesting the pieces that you put together and the charts you put together for the Two Nations of America post are incredibly revealing because of just seeing this big trough
right.
and then like the Berlin Wall falls and it all starts to crumble and the internet rises and it crumbles even more. And it's a really interesting, but it's not just that. And I think this is where I definitely want to get into this.
Yeah,
These two alternate institutions that have organizational power and how they are different in each of the nations, and that will then get us to the piece that you wrote this week.
yeah.
But anyway, carry on. I just wanted
Yeah,
to
sure.
I wanted to
So
footstop
I
that for a
would
second.
add, like, really importantly, the other exogenous factors, not to discount
Hmm.
broadcast news, but which is, I think, also like mostly a sort of consequence of what I'm about to say.
Hmm.
The um, the generation that converged was where the convergence happened and where you like hear about like all the comedy in Congress and where did it go,
Mm-hmm.
um, is was to a great extent a function of having fought side by side in a massive world war.
Yeah.
And I came to Washington in 1975 when most of the members of Congress were World War II veterans
Hmm.
or Korea War veterans. And it's really hard as a human being to have fought side by side with people, to come to realize that the sort of differences that get blown up now matter very little when you have such a greater enemy.
Hmm.
And I think that had a huge amount to do with why they were not screaming at each other, even though they
Right.
had as different or more different values underneath
Hmm.
it than we do today, right? I mean, you
Right.
literally had in 1975 still like the Southern senators had had veto bills to outlaw lynching, right? I mean, so as
Hmm.
wide as we think the divide on values and policy are now, it was really sort of wide then,
Hmm.
but they also had fought together. They also had a common vision of a sort of communist Soviet threat to the country that always
Hmm.
had to take precedent over domestic divides.
Right.
And that is why it's sort of named the end of the Cold War, because at that point, America lost its external enemy, right?
Right.
And the reasons that the sort of establishment forces, whether it's government or business or wherever, felt a need to pull together,
Hmm.
those constraints were gone and they just pulled apart, right?
And then the subsequent presidential election is the first time in however many years that we elected someone who had not served in the military
Right.
as president. That was seen as like, I mean, that was a big deal in the 92
Yeah.
election cycle. It was also just like a
Right.
huge departure from how we had thought about this.
Right. And it would not have happened 4 years earlier,
Right.
right? That it, but it was that fast that that external constraint on the natural oppositional forces in the country started unwinding, right?
Hmm.
That's when Newt Gingrich suddenly become, I mean, it's like that's when like this all
Right.
starts happening, right? And where business takes a much more aggressive role in trying to get out from the constraints of the New Deal, right?
Hmm.
And that's another really sort of big factor in all of this is that you go from the Democratic Party being one that labor was at the table for to basically two business parties.
Hmm.
Um, anyway, so, but that's sort of like where we are. And sort of some of the ways to understand how faulty even something like better than, more salient than individual demographic categories like urban, rural, suburban, right? Urban and rural clearly pack in a lot of the kind of place variation
Hmm.
and culture that goes beyond each person. But it's still the case that in blue suburbs,
Hmm.
we're as democratic as red cities, right?
Right.
That blue non-college, white non-college voters were more supportive of Biden than red college voters, right?
Hmm.
And and if you like sort of take the frame that I'm offering and look at a pretty contiguous two sections, right? Especially red America, right? You see a much more extracted industry, rural, very religious country, right? You're
Hmm.
like looking at Iran or Bulgaria, it's like literally the same kind of population, urban, rural stuff, right?
Right.
And then you look at blue, and it's like the most advanced, successful multiracial democracy in the world,
Hmm.
right? And they've been like going in opposite directions very fast since Obama. And so to try to understand, to then say, we're going to do a survey and count, you know, blue college voters the same way we count red college voters or, you know, any, especially any of the white categories. And to a point you were saying before, which is really, really important about identity, right? That it shouldn't be surprising that college, non college, for what you said, is it's just not really an identity. I mean, you may be a proud alum or something, but that you don't like belong to like people don't belong to a non-college association of America, and
Right.
there's like no non-college broadcasting network, right?
Yeah.
But there, right,
Right.
but there is a Christian broadcasting network,
Right.
right? And there is, and people do identify as Christian, right?
Hmm.
Than evangelical Christians. And one of the ways to see whether or not a tractable demographic category is useful for explanation is their partisan split, right? So
Hmm.
if you look at black voters, it's that is pretty close to the identity, right? And which is why it's been 90-10, right?
Right.
Because wherever you are in the country, for all the reasons, the experience of being black in America is not something you opt in or opt out of, right?
Right.
Um, to a great, not quite a great extent, and so it's only like 80-20, you have with white evangelicals higher in the South, because
Hmm.
it's also an identity that you are proud of, that and that your social circle shares,
Hmm.
right? And so that identity does drive your politics, right? But if
Right.
it's a category that's like 65, even 60-40 or 55-45, it's like flip a coin, right? It's not an
Yeah.
identity, right? It's just easy to count them. And if, and again, to where you started is like, why don't we do this, right? If you took white voters, even at a national level, and divided them first by do they identify as either evangelical or Christian, and then even do education, all three groups are going to suddenly pop more
Hmm. Hmm.
than college, non-college, right? And if you have, and most the best like way is just secular, Christian would be an easier way. If you had to, like, someone had a gun to your head and you have to say, like, what would, if you have to divide it
Hmm.
into two groups.
This is where I also think the way you tend to handle visualizing data is, if I were ever to, for some reason, give a lecture on why when most people use the phrase statistical significance, they're talking about the wrong end of
Yeah,
the equation, that like you tend to show like the magnitude of difference as opposed to just like the relative numbers.
right,
And that I think is incredibly useful for, as you say, pulling this apart quite a bit more. It also reveals something that I have been um, just thinking about a lot as you listen to the press try to wrestle with, um, what people say in polling and then like the statistics about what's going on in the country. And I think one of the other incredible things that you do in looking at the red states versus the blue states is the kind of conditions on the ground. And it's pretty amazing because if you think about the type of person who says in a poll that they think that the economy is bad, jobs are bad, wages are bad, um, working conditions are bad, crime is up, things are out of control with all sorts of things.
right,
There's too many teenagers getting pregnant and too many abortions and too much, whatever.
right,
If you want to find that reality, it exists in America. It does not exist in the blue cities. We're not, like
right,
they always want to make it be Chicago and New York, but it is in, the pundits do. But
yeah,
really what they're talking about is their own home states where they have almost all of the red states have passed vote restriction in the last 15 years. They have twice as many uninsured people all up and down the chain. They have lower life expectancies. They have basically entirely banned pre-viability abortion. But what do they get in return? They get double the rate of maternal mortality. They have much higher infant mortality rates. They have more teen pregnancies. They have 50% more juvenile incarcerations, double the total incarceration rate, more homicides, more firearm deaths, less spending on education, less graduation. Like it's not great in their
right.
world. And we're acting like, well, why aren't you living in the average? Like, why aren't you living here in the mean with the rest of us? Except that we're not living in the mean either. If we're living in blue states, we're living in
Right.
dynamic economies with lots of opportunity and lots of education and investment in public services by and large. And I think I just keep thinking about this, like, I don't know, almost state of disbelief that people live in, where there are things that they're not genuinely not experiencing, but they believe is possible or impossible. And then there's like the disconnect between what they're seeing on TV and what the press says and what shows up in the aggregate polling and what they're experiencing day to day in their lives. And so the blue state folks look at the red state polling and go, what are you guys talking about? That's not our experience at all. But what the red state people are in fact telling us is what their experience is. And that ought to be a big red flashing light about the
Yeah.
state of the Mutual Defense Pact, as you put it at the outset, which I love.
I think there's another, I agree, but I also think there's another dimension to the reality, a lot of the reality gap that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much on the crime, but on the economic set of indicators you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about. I think even in blue states, um, if you're a millennial or you're Gen Z,
Mm-hmm.
and um, like to an extent that, like, I don't know, like the actual point estimate, but like 80, whatever. I mean, a
Mm-hmm.
lot, right?
Yeah.
Your experience of entering the job market and
Oh, yeah.
how to navigate your life
Mm-hmm.
is so much worse than people before the Great Recession.
Yeah.
And that is not counted in what the economic data. And it is especially invisible to people who get platforms to talk about this stuff
Mm-hmm.
because they have among the most secure lifestyles in America, right?
Mm-hmm.
But where, people before that had good reason to think, I'm going to go into this career and that's what I'm going to be doing. And I'm going to have pretty good job security. And I'll just work one job and that job will have set hours and so forth, is not the actual reality in the job market for a big portion of those two generations,
Yeah.
right? They're working a couple jobs. They don't have control over their hours. All
Mm-hmm.
of those things wreak havoc on trying to have good marriage relationships or raise kids. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's just the level of stress that this new post-recession job rules, like all the gig working, all of those kinds of things. So
Mm-hmm.
it's even in blue states, it's not the unemployment rate just doesn't have the same meaning that it did before, right?
It's so true. We do a lot of work with higher education in the kind of online universities that are mainly servicing people who may have started college but didn't complete it or never started college to begin with and now need a bachelor's for whatever
Right.
their job path is. I think it's underrated how many kind of non-college jobs, if you want a promotion, suddenly require a college degree.
Right.
And so you got to go back and get that, nursing bachelor's in order to get the promotion out of being a mere nursing assistant, right?
Right.
So these are the types of people we're talking to. People want to be teachers, nurses, social workers. And we did some groups with like 18 to 24-year-olds, because that's not the typical audience for these for these
Right.
services. And we talked to people who were not bound to top 150 schools, right? These were
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
who were thinking about community college or an associate's degree. And I was struck at the time, and this was kind of mid-pandemic, or well, late mid-pandemic, by how the younger they were, the more desirous of stability and predictability. And I'm going to, the reason I would go to college is to get a degree that would get me a job that I would be able to just work in that job and it would pay me enough to be able to get married and have kids and have a little house.
Right.
These are not people with like McMansion dreams, right?
No, that's the point.
They are not.
Right.
And I found myself thinking, you want the life that my World War II veteran grandfather had, who fought, got the GI Bill, got an education, taught school, became a school district superintendent, was a member of a union, obviously,
Right.
before he became superintendent. Like, he had pensions, public employee
Right.
pensions, military pensions. He could afford the little house in St. Helens, Oregon, and,
Yeah.
like all of that kind of stuff. That's what they want my grandfather's life. And of course, I'm a
Right.
Gen Xer who was never promised such a thing. So I'm like slightly baffled, but it is amazing um, how even more perilous it feels to those kids who are not bound for even the state university. They're bound for the community college down the road at best. And also just like, yeah, I mean, this is the group, non-college young people. Like, it is
Right.
not in the discourse. If you are young, you're at Yale protesting the war.
Right. Exactly. And that's sort of what I'm saying. So it's not like there is the different, really important on the ground differences between being
Mm-hmm.
whatever in red and blue America. But we shouldn't overlook that even in blue America,
Yeah.
this is a real problem. And where I was going to go, where you sort of started, it is that the other, to a certain extent, like you sometimes hear about the Great Recession as being
Mm-hmm.
a factor in this, but I think COVID is like so big
Mm-hmm.
in all of this dissatisfaction in a way that's not acknowledged because in America, like working culturally is like who you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's, you know, you're seen as a success or a failure by how you work, and you, like, because of the way things are, you sort of think you have a job because you deserve it and you lost it because you don't,
Right.
right? And with COVID, you had tens of millions of people fired
Yes.
without, and the checks were obviously kept everyone alive.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of having illusions about like you mattering in the society, or that like you would be able to go back to what you were doing, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you were naked,
One
right?
of the people in our groups for that, I will never forget, because what they said about COVID was that it taught them that the rest of the world, and I'm quoting them, it taught me that the rest of the world does not care whether I live or die.
Exactly. Perfect. Right. That's what I'm saying. Right. And so for like person in commentator circle to say, why don't they know that, real incomes went up by 5%? What are they complaining about? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like are completely oblivious to what you were just saying.
Mm.
Right. That doesn't cut it for as compensation.
Well, I think this is also why I like this analysis, is that it feels more holistic and complete, and it also offers something better than correlation. Right?
Right.
It explains like how people got into the mindsets and political preferences that they express, as opposed to saying that there's some sort of direct line between your demographic
Right.
identity and your political preferences. It is more about the water you're boiling in.
Right.
In the case
Right.
of
Now
some
to
folks,
your
yeah.
water you're boiling in, the problem is that you're boiling in the water and the media is telling you to be grateful for the sauna.
Right.
Right? Right? That it's your problem that you think it's boiling water that's gonna,
Yeah.
fry you. That's not the right word, but you know what I mean,
Yeah.
right? I mean it's
Right.
like like we have a sauna. What's your problem?
Right. Yes. And then I think there is this interesting kind of other side of it, which is, we don't get to these anti-voting rights, anti-workers' rights, anti-public investment, anti-women, anti-immigrant, anti policies all on our own. Like that, there are other institutions helping to reify and prop that up and fund it and all of the rest of it. And I think one of the things I wanted to get to in this conversation is your piece, most recent piece, talking um, about unions and about this fascinating fact, which is that of all the institutions in America, the one that's actually gaining approval and trust is unions, that people are less and less seeing unions as only being of benefit to union members, but actually seeing it as of benefit to the entire economy and to workers in general. I think the one thing I think the Harris campaign gets really right is talking about it that way of like, if you like a
Right.
40-hour work week, if you like weekends, if you like paid vacation, thank
Right.
a union
Exactly.
member. But I think it's interesting to think about those as competing institutions and you talk about this as one of the things about unions is they are inherently democratic institutions, and churches aren't. They just aren't.
Right.
Like, we know this.
No,
They're
God wouldn't
hierarchical
have that,
institutions.
right?
No.
Like you don't get to vote on the 10 Commandments, right? I
No.
mean,
No. The Last Supper was not people getting together for a caucus to vote on what to do next. If I may be so blasphemous.
yeah,
But I think this is the other interesting thing about it is that Red America is also a right to work America, which means anti-union America.
right.
Yet another one of these. I don't know. Can we thank Frank Luntz for this one too? The kind of the phrase means the opposite of what it sounds like.
Right,
You know?
way preceded his birth, but
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, probably true. But that kind of even the distinction you draw in that kind of northern Midwest of, you know, well, what makes, you know, Michigan wobbly and Wisconsin worrisome and Minnesota safe for Democrats? Well, Minnesota protects the right to unionize, and Michigan's gone back and forth, and Wisconsin is a right to work state. And so maybe just to kind of talk about how you see these two institutions as having a role in helping the actual, because as you said at the very beginning, we are the most federalist country probably in the world. All of our political preferences are mediated by who we vote for from places. The places themselves are the ones with the true sovereignty. And now we have returned to exactly the problem that the founders did worry about, which was not exactly partisan polarization, but factionalism.
right,
And that, I think, is an important distinction where these red states are voting in red states' interests as opposed to voting in the nation's interests or trying to kind of find common cause with the blue states or blue nation. And so like the people are in the middle. You know, there are kind
right,
of powerful economic interests on both sides. Some basic differences, fundamental differences in a vision for what American life is supposed to be, and whether we even really like democracy all that much. And in the middle is just all of us trying to, you know, go through the motions of voting in the hopes that it will
yeah,
have an outcome that we want. But, yeah, so I just kind of want to let you cook on that because I think it's a really
sure,
interesting and powerful idea.
sure. And like for your Madison fans on the podcast, right? The
Who
like
will
his idea.
remain the shortest president. If Kamala Harris is elected, she will still be a half inch taller than Madison was.
I had not measured that.
I looked that up the other
Um,
night.
um, so, and he was talking in Federalist 10 about the dangers of faction
Mm-hmm.
and felt that our system of government, with all the checks and balances and what he anticipated as shifting alliances and such, would actually be a genius solution to the problem of factions gaining control. In fact, the Constitution makes it prefers factions if they can get their act together because very it's really pretty easy to hack this country, its institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So, as an example, if you think about the Republican caucus and in the House, for example, and how it's changed since, say, 2010, gotten even so much more extreme. And Mike Johnson is a devout evangelical Christian, right? Like, how did that happen? Right. Well, it happens because with gerrymandering and partisan sorting and such, you in red congressional districts in the South, evangelical voters make up usually 40 to 60 or more percent of primary voters.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't do that. That isn't an observation or a description of the primary electorate. it is the lever that institutional evangelical churches can determine who the candidates are going to be
Mm,
that actually go to Congress, right? And
right.
for, from around the 1970s after Roe, when the religious right started to align with the Republicans, at that point, those churches were pretty quiescent about endorsing whoever the business side of the coalition
Hmm.
thought should be the member of Congress, and
Right.
that sort of made those districts Republican.
Hmm.
After Obama, right, you had the Tea Party rebellion, which was very much about purging the Republican Party of rhinos.
Hmm.
And in that period, from the 2010 election till around 2012, 2014, whatever, you just had more successful primary challenges of Republican members of Congress than any other period, any other party, in American history,
Mm.
because of that latent power, right?
Hmm.
And that's just one of the kinds of hacks that a determined, coherent, clustered minority can accomplish, right? And because again, we have this sort of geographic representation, you beginning, you know, with Roberts and Alito, you get the control that that faction exercises within the Republican Party,
Hmm.
insisting on Supreme Court appointments that are not only like what conservative used to mean, but are committed to accomplishing an agenda that couldn't be accomplished multi-democratically
Hmm.
just by fiat,
Right.
right? And that's another hack, right? So that America is such a self unforced error, right? And right, I mean, not that it would be
Yeah.
nirvana, but the way we try to govern ourselves makes it so much more difficult to
Yeah.
to have a
And there's
good
so
life.
many of those unforced errors along the way. Like, I went to law school. I think I was slightly shocked when I read Marbury versus Madison, which is like the first thing you
Right.
read in con law. And it's like, oh, you just got to give yourself power. It's not in the Constitution. Marbury versus Madison is the moment when the Supreme Court says we are the Supreme Court. We get to decide more things, and it says we get to decide in the Constitution. And everyone just goes and goes, okay, like who's going to check them? Well, Congress, but Congress didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal. And this kind of like, it's not that big of a deal thing just keeps happening
Right.
over time, and it's a compounding error. And you're right that it's the problem of creating a too complicated system is it creates more threat surface area, right? The more
Right. And
complicated and
it's
bigger you
and
make it.
ultimately the problem of creating a constitution that in a sense is meant to be a defense against democracy, um,
Yeah,
like
just
creates.
enough democracy, just enough.
Well, it
That's where
depends
the
on what you mean by democracy. Right. I mean, which is,
right.
you know, but right, but it it's always it's always been there from the beginning to be a constraint on America's democratic impulses. It has
Hmm.
always functioned that way. And the one exception that I think has led to people fall in love with it for the wrong reason is Brown. And
Hmm.
right.
Yes,
And
another mid-century cultural anomaly.
right.
Yeah.
And in a sense that against all like historical evidence, that the purpose of the court is to protect the weak and to, the marginal and
Hmm.
and so forth. And that's a big part of why like, they continue for quite a while to be able to not provoke resistance from a more progressive or even centrist legal community
Hmm.
because of the sort of belief that that was the purpose of the court. And
Right.
it's just not. And don't mind the diversion. It's kind of interesting. It's really important to remember that, and I'm not Brown bashing, but I'm Brown contextualizing,
Mm-hmm.
is that there's much less there than meets the eye,
Right.
right? That the reason Brown happened, um, in addition to obviously a lot of activism and such, was that
Mm-hmm.
at that point, a really fairly um, cohesive national security establishment was coming out of World War II. And the decision makers of that era, the Eisenhowers, the Trumans, and so on, right? One of the most disruptive events in their early lives were the race riots in 1919 when black service
Mm-hmm.
people were coming back from World War One.
Right.
And there were many fewer of them than the millions that were going to come back from World War II.
Mm.
And in addition, by the end of the war, they understood that America wasn't going to demobilize, but was going to be in the long twilight struggle against communism. And
Right.
that they had to have an integrated armed forces. They couldn't, that was necessary. And most importantly, perhaps of all, is that in the international competition for decolonizing countries, that America was an apartheid country, kind of was communism's best
Mm-hmm.
calling card.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, you could not even debate a lynching bill on the floor of the Senate, let alone
Right.
deconstruct Jim Crow. And so Brown was the answer, right? It was a unanimous decision reflecting the national security imperatives. And obviously, like, we want that, all the things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it was in that context. And if you go back, there are amici from the State Department and the media at
Right.
the time. A big part of the argument was that America internationally had to shed its reputation as an apartheid, a legitimate, I mean, honestly, a apartheid country. And it did it in one decision, right? And it disrupted the sort of civil rights movement of the time in a couple of ways. One was that, along with desegregating the military and other things, it tamped things down, right? And it
Right.
arguably positively opened the space for nonviolent resistance that you
Yeah.
get with King and
Mm-hmm.
so forth, because it sort of set the the predicate for that. But it was also a way, up until, again, lost to history, there were two different, and maybe in your law stuff you saw this, there were two different strains for challenging Plessy. One was on education at a sort of individual right level, and another
Mm-hmm.
was economic rights.
Right.
And that was much scarier to the establishment. So this became a much lesser seeming disruptive, and it would be one that was really isolated to the Jim Crow states, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't get Eisenhower sending in the 101st Airborne to integrate Little Rock if it isn't a national security imperative, right? So it's
Right.
that, and then you get Brown 2, which says, actually, unlike any other constitutional decision we've ever made, you don't actually have to do this one until you're ready, right?
Right.
Right. And like, and so that's sort of like the best of the court, right?
Yeah.
And um but yeah,
This
so that,
also
I don't know
feels
how to get
very
down.
related to. I have yet to read this book, the Bomb Power by Gary Wills. But the guys that know your enemy were talking about it a couple of months ago, and it has rewired my brain in understanding how we got to this place where uh, we think the president is the king, and in many respects, it's the bomb. That's why.
Yeah, oh
Like
yeah.
that's why
100%.
nuclear codes. That's why, and yet it winds up like just poisoning. I mean, obviously it has poisoned the well in so many ways that we wind up with these kind of, even like the question, one of the questions Dana Bash asked Harris about immigration. Why did it take you so long to do an executive order? It's not technically our job. it's actually Congress's job is the correct answer, right? Like, why did we wait? Because we were trying to do a bill. And when we couldn't get a bill done, well, then all that's left is this thing that is fairly extra constitutional, executive orders. And we just don't get very excited anymore about executive orders. I remember a brief period in the first Bush term, I think, where people were very upset about presidential signing statements,
Right.
where Bush would sign a bill, but then write a memo saying, I
Right.
totally
Saying I
disagree with
don't mean
this.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. But we seem to have just completely given over to not I think like the imperial president isn't even quite the right one. It is like the nuclear president. Like they
Right.
have all the power because they've got the biggest gun. And that has completely rewired my brain and thinking about how we understand this stuff. But it winds up showing up in polling about like what you want the president to do when it's not his or her power to do. And
Right.
yet Congress doesn't have to do it because everyone thinks it's the president's job now. And that also creates this kind of feedback loop of there's no need to do anything. There's no need to reckon with anything or change anything or pass any legislation. We can just keep fighting at the margins. And that is rewarded by the factionalism. That's rewarded by the way that everything kind of gets way too divvied up and too close for anything approaching compromise to occur. It's also interesting to think about that the reason that mutual, I love this idea of a mutual defense pact is what the Constitution fundamentally is, because it's true. I mean, the Articles of Confederation failed to create a cohesive mutual defense pact. That's why they fell, right? It was too messy.
Right.
So here we'll get together and agree to be on the same side. But that really only works when there is a unifying enemy. And so it works in the early republic. It
Right.
works in the mid-century, World War II, through the Cold War. But it doesn't work when we're just fighting each other.
Right. Because we have so established two different ways of living in the world, two different ways of being, right? And, both Red America and Blue America, if they were just countries, right, would be the second and third largest GDPs in the world.
Mm.
They'd both be, by population, almost the largest ones outside of Asia.
Right.
Right. And like that, there are coherent national values and senses of what government's for, right? In Red America, the sort of theocratic bent is that government is needed to make sure people follow the already revealed laws and adhere to the social structures and what we know to be true. And
Right.
in Blue America, to a remarkable extent, there's a willingness to believe that compromise and working together makes everybody better off in the end.
Right.
Right. And like those are just so different, right?
Right.
And they're solving for different kinds of countries.
So where I want to end this then is
Well, actually, before you do that, just because
sure.
one of the things, because if you're into Gary Wills,
Mm.
did you read
Not yet, but I
his?
will be soon.
Okay,
I only
well,
know what I heard
he
from the
famously, I think it was in his Declaration of Independence. But look, there was a very famous Atlantic article about this, where he observed that before the Civil War, the United States was plural, right? United Modified States, right? In
Right.
the grammar, right? Because people understood it as a group of states,
Right.
right? After the Civil War, he argued, people started using it as a singular noun phrase,
Right.
right? The way we use it
The
today, right?
Yeah.
The United States did this, not the United States does this, right?
Right.
Which he argued
Yeah.
was a reflection of becoming a single nation, right? Which sort of goes a bit against what we've been talking about. More recently, some academics looked, and what he was saying was really only true in the North, that for quite a while, the usage after the Civil War continued to be plural in in like the rebellious states.
Right.
And that is their conception, right? Right. It's
Right.
why, Greg Abbott can say, it's our border to defend, right?
Yes.
And and this is really important because people like on our side of the Dobbs line,
Hmm.
um, like think that at some point the people on the other side agreed that America should have our values. And therefore, every time they do something like that, we think they're breaking a norm or a promise or something like
Hmm.
that. Whereas they never agreed. And
Right.
if your expectations come from that understanding, nothing is surprising about what they're doing. They
Hmm.
think they're a nation.
Right. I've been thinking about this a lot recently because the back in like 2003 or 4, I did a project for, of all people, USA Network. And they wanted to do a rebranding and some things like that. But we went out and did a bunch of focus groups. And at the end of almost every focus group, we'd say, "Do you have any questions for us?" And the people, someone in almost every group would say, "Yeah, why is it called USA?" And we were sort of like, "That's odd."
Yeah,
Like, isn't it obvious? And so we went back out and did what we lovingly referred to as America Zeitgeist research, just to like find out like what's USA, what's America, what do you think of all of this stuff? And it was fascinating because there is this kind of abstraction level where we all agree on some basic things, like the Purple Mountains Majesty, fields of grain, and all that stuff. Like the majesty of the physical country is something we all agree on. An idea that diversity is good is actually something that everyone kind of agrees on, but what they mean by that and how they would structure that is not the same. And so you get these kind of lofty principles where we all kind of nod our heads and go, "Yes, that fills my patriotic heart." And then it's like, "All right, let's make that practical." And things start getting real different real
right.
fast depending on what part of the country you're in. And I have been thinking about, that was 20 years ago. What is brand America now? Would people still agree on those things as being all of equal import? But the thing I did want to close on is, one
Yeah,
of the things I love in your thinking as well is to worry less about the margin of error and worry more about the margin of effort, right? And so, what is the effort, given these foundational, meaning from the founding, differences between these regions of America that essentially make up two countries in a mutual defense pact? What is to be done? Where can people start to bend the arc, since it doesn't
yeah.
bend on its own?
So first of all, I don't like the bend the arc.
Yeah, me
The
neither.
right
I hate
the I
it.
think that there's like no arc, in the moral universe or anything like that.
Yeah.
From the beginning of the time, it's been just a big thick rope that we're in a tug of war between the privileged and the less privileged, and that sometimes, like during the New Deal period, like the line moves really fast towards the less privileged. And other
Hmm.
times, like these last decades, it's moved very much in the other direction. And
Hmm.
it's not like coincidental that in the first period, there was a commitment to community, strong community institutions as the part of democracy, unions, social clubs, all those kinds of things. And
Hmm.
that a big part of the last 50 years has been doing as much to destroy community and make people think change comes from their individual actions, not from joining together with other people and expressing power and like getting together and pulling on that rope.
Hmm.
Right. So when I say margin of effort, I really just mean in terms of like surviving these elections, right? That
Mm.
in these 6 states that'll decide whether it's Trump or Harris, in Wisconsin, it was Trump won by 20,000 and then Biden won by 20,000. I mean,
Right.
it's not predetermined. It's you can go out and register enough voters or do the things that make it
Hmm.
happen, right? And we have to keep doing that to sort of get another shot at a more perfect union, right?
Right.
But that by itself doesn't create a more perfect union that we can then go back to our lives and say, well, that's done. Now it's going to be great, right? It doesn't
Right.
work that way. And so I think the two things that like have to change, right? One is that, and this is what you were saying before, and about how unions are seen as like actually a more credible, important kind of thing. Even, and this is what really is amazing, across partisan lines, right? As even it's a Democratic Party inflected institution, like now almost half of Republicans approve, right? And it was a
Right.
big increase because they see their own aspirations in it, their own, and that
Mm-hmm.
it's a functioning organization, right? It's like unions routinely deliver for members better wages, better pensions, healthcare, more job security, right? They are routinely delivering what the political system has stopped delivering for people.
Mm-hmm.
And that explains a lot of it. And so people have to continue to move from seeing, oh, yeah, I like unions in the way I like the Save the Whale Club or something, right? And
Right.
instead see it um, as essential for their own well-being, whether they belong to one or not, because it balances sort of power that otherwise like makes your life miserable. The second thing that has to happen is that there has to be a moment where we don't take all the completely irrational and self-destructive aspects of our system as immovable, just
Yes.
be learned helplessness about the Constitution and all of these things, and say no, like that doesn't have to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And have an alternative. And instead of like every conversation about doing something ending with what about the filibuster or whatever,
Yeah.
is right, is is make that mind shift, right? As late as 1775, most of the founders couldn't imagine not being part of Britain. And then like a year later, we have America,
Right.
right?
Right.
Right? Because at some point, everybody realizes this is not going to work,
Right.
right? And we have to take agency and responsibility for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that moment has to start happening here too.
Right.
And to just like bring it right back to crosstabs, right? Polling makes it harder for us to see that
Yes.
because it projects an idea of America in which what we see is the result of our collective revealed preferences. That, right, we all get to vote, so this must be the country we want, right?
Right.
And if we don't have what we want, it's because we really didn't want whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we have to shift to thinking about a more pluralistic kind of democracy that we used to have.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a convenient bedtime story. I think pollsters tell themselves that like, no, this is how the people tell the politicians what they want is through polling.
Right.
It's
But
like,
even sort of like that, that's great that you say that, right? Because it's like the that kind of idea is so ingrained, right? Is that
hmm
right? But because there's no coverage, like written out of the political story, are all the other things that politicians have to solve for, like campaign contributions,
right.
like folks that can exercise lots of power against them,
hmm
right? What polls give them are a set of things to search for that are popular that are not rejected or vetoed by those with power, right?
hmm
And that's a big part of why our politics is so exclusively about, quote, social issues now,
hmm
because economic issues, that precarity that we were talking about earlier, is off the table
Right.
because the business interests in both parties would have none of it. And so it's a path of much less resistance to just differ on the issues that don't really impinge on those interests.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. The solution is more collective action and true collective action. I think the kind of self-help model of everything
Right.
anymore is personally driving me insane. Like this is,
Yeah.
there was something about I was listening to, I think she wrote for The Atlantic, but she was writing about air conditioning and said, well, it's really a collective action problem. And so everyone individually should
Right.
decide to turn up the AC to 72 and then turn it up to 75 at night. And the person interviewing her was like, is there room here for government regulation? She's like, no, 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 no. And I was like, is what? Like, what do you
Yeah.
understand collective action to be? Because it sounds
Right.
like what you understand it to be is like an Instagram meme. And
Right.
we're all going to
Exactly.
decide, sleep at 75 is now the hashtag of the week. And that will solve global warming
Right.
or something.
Right. No, exactly. It's like, how many books have you read that are like the first 9 of 10 chapters about climate change are like all the horrible things, and the 10th chapter is solutions, recycle, carpool, right? Nothing that challenges like the
Hmm.
people actually producing the problem.
Right. Well, it's refreshing to have a conversation like this end on advice that says band together and
Yeah.
form institutions of power, as opposed to here's what you write a letter, send a postcard.
Right.
I
Exactly.
mean, do that too, but
Yeah.
but the bigger thing is, I think this, and I think like that may be one of the I think one last thing I want to say about the
Yeah.
union thing is I think an interesting thread has come into public discourse about union members and that union members had turned Republican. And that isn't true.
No.
and yet there was this idea that like the union bosses, they supported the Democrats, but the union members, they're the lunch pail burly guy at the
Right.
diner in Wisconsin, he's a Republican. And that isn't true. But also that the union doesn't really care what party you belong to, right? The union cares about ensuring your rights as workers and actually transforming you into, through collective action, a unit of economic power as opposed to uh, an asset that's being moved around the board,
Sure.
and an
And
asset and
yeah.
an expense.
Yeah,
Right.
so like in
You're
2020, something like 58% of union members voted for Biden. And unlike, say, Move On or
mhm,
the ACLU, whatever, where people join because of their values, people are in unions because that's what they find at their job for the
mhm,
most part.
yeah,
And there's study after study in my own personal experience for decades
right.
that that the experience of realizing your linked fate and figuring out what your priorities are for your next contract and
Mhm,
understanding that like there's not a lot of room for like a white dividend in it or a male dividend in it, not zero, but
mhm,
not like in the rest of the country, breaks down a lot of people's um, sense of division and tribalism, right?
right.
and and because people who do that also realize that they don't have to just accept that what the employer says they should be paid is a measure of their own worth,
Mhm,
but that they can like assert what they're worth
right.
collectively and get it is just so outside the American experience everywhere
Right.
else in the workforce.
Yeah. It is a fundamentally different experience than, for instance, like, I don't know, getting involved in your local Democratic Party, where
Right.
that's not the set of dynamics in
No, no,
play.
it's complete.
Yeah.
No, because you've decided to be a Democrat.
Right. Right. And also, like, if you're volunteering, you have no actual power in that group. The paid people get the power, and
Right.
you just get told where to go knock on doors.
Exactly.
As always, Mike, I'm
Yeah.
sure you have other things to do this morning.
Likewise.
This was fantastic.
Great.
I'm so glad we got to talk about this in more detail because I just don't I don't think people are asking you enough about this, Mike. I don't think that they are.
I
Uh,
agree, but like we just have to keep
yes.
going.
Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farah Bostic, production by The Difference Engine, and edited now by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. Find us at crosstabspodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our weekly Substack, also available at crosstabspod.substack.com. Tell your friends about the show, subscribe on your favorite podcast service, and give the show a rating or review. I would love to hear from you, and it will help other people find the show. Email me if you have any questions, ideas for episode topics, suggestions for future guests, or want to talk about ways we can work together at farah@crosstabspodcast.com. See you next time.